Greetings everyone and welcome in today's PCB webinar. My name is Gzim and I am the account manager for security portfolio at PCB. Today I will be as an organizer of this webinar and I hope we will have a very interactive webinar with all the questions and your comments. Just for your information, I assume you all know that PCB organizes daily webinar in our 5 portfolios, and every week we organize a webinar on a security portfolio covering different topics and areas. In this webinar, we will hear about the topic an overview of risk assessment according to ISO 27001 and ISO 27005. This webinar will be presented from our partner, Mr. Dejan Kosutic, who is the main ISO 27001 expert on Advisera. He has an extensive working experience both as an tutor and as a consultant. We hope this webinar will help you understand the importance of risk assessment in ISO 27001 and ISO 27005. And if you have any question, you can write them at any time in the question box in the right-hand control panel, or you can use the option to raise your hand and we will answer to all of them accordingly. Please, Dejan, you may continue now.
Thank you, Gazim, for this introduction. So yeah, let me go to the this slide. So basically, as Gazim was mentioning in this webinar today, I'll give you an overview of risk assessment and treatment according to ISO 27001 and ISO 27005. So by the way, I do a lot of consulting and training and writing of the articles regarding 27001. I'm not sure if you already read my blog, so basically I'll try to somehow summarize what I think is the best approach to do the risk assessment according to these two standards in this webinar today in these following 30 minutes. Okay, so you know, very often I see companies that are stuck at this point when they have to make the risk assessment, and you know, they think that they will have to spend like endless you know, mandates for this step, like 6 or 12 months. And really, I mean, this is really not necessary. You really don't have to spend too much time doing the risk assessment, but you have to, let's say, optimize it and really make it applicable to your company. So in this webinar today, I'll speak about how to approach the task of risk assessment and what are the basic steps that are required really in ISO 27001 and suggested by, let's say, 27005. Just to note here that this webinar is intended for people who are, let's say, beginners in this area, and so I'll really explain some of the basic let's say, requirements, and I'll use some very let's say, easy language to explain you how this should be done through ISO 27001. And if you're looking for some, let's say, more detailed explanations on risk management, then please do see other webinars both on PCB websites and 27001 Academy websites. So if you want to succeed with a risk assessment, then first you need to understand the significance, why this is important, and also you need to understand what is really accepted according to ISO 27005. So really you have to understand the basics really before going and moving into doing the risk assessment and of course risk treatment afterwards. And this is exactly what I'll show you at today's webinar. Good. So, and you know, many companies are really thinking that risk assessment is nothing else but a kind of a bureaucratic step that doesn't really have any real significance, and that actually they can do the risk assessment after they finish all the documentation or all the implementation. And really, this is, you know, completely wrong. Risk management is actually the first the first big step in the ISO 27001 implementation. It has to be done before you implement all the controls, because actually when you perform this risk assessment and treatment, then you can actually define what will happen afterwards, meaning which controls will need to be implemented. And during the webinar I'll explain exactly how this is done. So the agenda for today: first, I'll explain why risk management is important. Then I'll explain you this process of risk management, how it works, how it is defined in the ISO 27001. I'll also show you what are the mandatory elements of risk assessment, because very often people tend to, bring too many elements into risk assessment, and then really it becomes too complicated and really too lengthy and too, I don't know, cumbersome. Then I'll show you some techniques on how to identify the assets, also threats and vulnerabilities, and finally which kind of scales you can use for assessing the impact and likelihood. Okay, very good. Basically this is what I'll cover today. So we have, I would say, a little bit less than 30 minutes, so I'll try to finish in time. Of course, if you have any questions, you can send them even before I finish the webinar. Now, let me go first through why this risk assessment or risk management is needed. And just to explain, risk management is basically has two main parts. First one is risk assessment, and then the second part is risk treatment. So risk assessment and risk treatment together are called risk management. So first of all, ISO 27001 defines what is called information security management system. So basically this is kind of a framework that gives you some basic rules on how to handle your information security. Now within this framework you have, I would say, three main parts, so to say. The first one is this risk management, which is also defined by through the standard called ISO 27005. I'll come back a little bit later on this, let's say, to explain this difference between 27001 and 27005. Now, once you actually find out where the risks are, meaning once you find out where which potential things or which potential problems could happen, and once you find out which controls you will use to decrease those risks, then you can actually move on to the second, let's say, part of managing security, and this is implementation of the safeguards. These safeguards are actually called controls in ISO 27001, and you can use the standard called ISO 27002 for the details about the implementation. The third really important, let's say, part of the security management is the measurement. Basically, by measurement, you really want to find out if you have achieved everything that you have planned for in the beginning. So you will, let's say, measure if the effectiveness of the implemented controls are on the adequate level, and this is something where ISO 27004 standard can help you about measurement of information security. So what is the relationship between ISO 27001 and 27005 and 27002 and 27004? Again, 27001 gives you, let's say, the framework. It explains how these different, let's say, elements or parts interact with each other. But it doesn't really explain you the details. So, for instance, when it comes to risk management, ISO 27001 gives you some, I would say, very let's say, plain requirements, but it doesn't really tell you how to implement risk assessment or risk treatment. And for this purpose, you can use 27005 because it gives you the details or some suggested methodologies on how to do it. And similar thing is with 27002 and 27004. Okay. Now let's move on to the next slide, and before this actually I have a question from Dionysis, and he says, disagree, risk management for information technology is part of information security governance, itself part of information governance and much broader than the presenter said. Okay, first of all, we are not speaking here about the risk management for information technology. We are speaking about the risk management for information security. So basically this is something that you are basically covering all the risks that can be part of, let's say, your whole company. So what I'm speaking about are the risks that you can find related to information security, and let's say only half of these risks are related to information technology. And the other half of the risks will be related to, let's say, your human resources, to your, let's say, lack of organizational capabilities and so on. And of course, I mean, risk management or information security risk management is a part of, let's say, wider company-wide risk management, which can be, of course, let's say, managed in some bigger corporations, or let's say, unmanaged or done in some informal way in some smaller companies. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. What is the process of risk management as defined in ISO 27001? So first of all, risk assessment methodology. This is something that you have to do at the beginning. Now, why is this really important? Because if you don't have a very clear idea on how this risk management or risk assessment and treatment needs to be done, then you will probably run into problems. So first you have to set the rules, and then you have to act upon these rules. So this is the reason why you should first start with the defining the methodology. Later on, I'll give you some examples on what you should include in this methodology. The second step is to perform the risk assessment itself. So again, a risk assessment means nothing else but finding out where the risks are. Okay. And also risk assessment means how big these risks are, meaning how dangerous they are. The third step is doing something about those biggest risks. So risk treatment is basically using safeguards and other, let's say, methods to control the biggest risks that are really, let's say, dangerous for you. The next step that is defined actually in ISO 27001 is to write a document called Statement of Applicability. Now this Statement of Applicability is nothing else but let's say, a list of all the controls from the Annex A, and for you who have read the standard, you know that this Annex A of ISO 27001 has 114 controls. So basically in Statement of Applicability you have to define which controls are applicable and which are not. And you will apply, or you will mark only those controls as applicable where you have some risks which need to be, let's say, controlled by those controls. So, for instance, out of 114 controls, very often you will see that 105 controls are selected as applicable because there are risks which require these controls to be implemented. And the final step, fifth step, is really to develop a risk treatment plan. And this risk treatment plan is basically a document which describes the implementation plan for the controls that need to be implemented. Now, since this webinar today is about risk assessment, not really about risk treatment, I won't spend too much time about Statement of Applicability and risk treatment plan. This is something that perhaps I can cover with some other webinars. Anyway, these are the 5 steps that you must do according to 27001. This is something you have to do if you want to get certified, if you want to be compliant with the standard. Okay, now let's move on to elements of a risk assessment. So when you write your risk assessment methodology, what is it really that you need to include in this methodology? You have to write actually what are the elements that you have to perform, and here they are. I mean, I'll show you now the minimum that you have to do according to ISO 27001, and of course you can add some additional elements if you think that they're really necessary. So first of all, ISO 27001 requires you to identify all the information security risks. Okay, so this one is a mandatory element. You need to have it. Second element is the so-called risk owner. You need to define who are the owners of the risks. Now, risk owners are basically people who are, let's say, both interested in and who have enough power to do something about this risk. So, for instance, let's say that you have a risk which would, which relates, I don't know, to potential loss of your data. So this is something, potential loss of your data, let's say, in your data center. So probably the head of this department, of IT department, or head of the data center will be the owner of this risk, because this person has enough authority, and of course he's very interested in resolving this, this risk. Then comes the part which is also mandatory, and this is the risk analysis. Now, risk analysis is a part where you have to define how big is the risk. Because, I mean, if you're, I don't know, a large company, you might have thousands and thousands of risks, and of course not all of the risks are the same. So you have to somehow judge to which risks you should focus on, and this is exactly the analysis. It will show you which risks are bigger and which risks are smaller. So any risks that are, let's say, too big, and it is usually called all the risks that are not acceptable, and then you will focus on those risks later on in the risk treatment. Now, how to identify the risk, how to do the risk analysis. I'll show you now. Typically, risk identification is done by the methodology called asset-based identification or asset-based risk identification. This basically means that you will find all the assets and then identify all the threats to those assets and then find all the vulnerabilities. Now, just to mention, this methodology of this asset-based methodology is not mandatory. This is, let's say, one of the ways you can do it, and this is something that I typically recommend to my clients because it is still the most widespread method that you can do. Even though this is not, let's say, prescribed by the latest revision of ISO 27001, again, I think this is the best method that you could use to identify risks. I'll give you later on a couple of examples on how to assess or how to identify the assets and threats and vulnerabilities. Now, when it comes to risk analysis, the standard actually requires you to analyze the risk by finding out how big potential impact, what is the potential impact of this risk, and also what is the likelihood that this risk can happen. Okay, and once you have the impact and likelihood, then you can actually calculate the level of risk. So basically the risk is either a multiplication of impact and likelihood, or the risk is, let's say, when you add these two values up together. Okay, okay, so the point is, as you can see, risk identification, risk owner, impact, likelihood, and the calculation of risk, these are the 5 elements that are mandatory. So for smaller companies, I mean, you can have these 5 elements and be perfectly compliant with the standard. You don't need really anything else about this. And unfortunately, I've seen, too many times that companies are using like 7 or 8 or 10, different variables as part of their risk assessment, only because they think that it will be, I don't know, better or more precise and, something like this. And the fact is, bringing in too many variables into this equation will only make it much harder, and it really won't help them. And, for instance, in the 27001 Academy, we sell these templates for the not only for risk assessment but for whole ISO 27001 implementation. And we always, try to suggest to our clients that they should use the simplest methodology possible, because this will enable them to finish the task quickly, but also, I would say, on the satisfactory level. Okay, now just to explain a couple of things more. First of all, the differences between the latest revision, 2013 revision, is different from the actually required methodology in previous 2005 revision of 27001, in terms of that the 2013 requires you to have risk owner. Okay, so this is new when compared to 2005 revision. Also, what is different is that 2005 revision required you to have assets and threats and vulnerabilities, and this is something that does not exist in this 2013 revision. So these two elements are actually different between the two revisions of ISO 27001. Okay, now I have a couple of questions, so let me go through them. So Dionysis asks, what about risk policy definition and scoping the risk assessment process before selecting the methodology? Okay, so first of all, ISO 27001 does not require you to write risk policy. And I mean, if you're a smaller company, then producing a document like risk policy would be really be for me too much, I wouldn't really see a benefit of something like this. If you're a larger company, then yes, and you could have something like a risk policy which would, let's say, be compliant with your corporate risk policy. But in any case, you should write the methodology before going into the whole process of doing the risk assessment. Okay, Thina is asking why risk treatment plan is coming after doing the risk treatment. Shouldn't be vice versa. Okay, let me explain you. So risk treatment step, which is the third step, is basically selecting the most appropriate controls. Now, risk treatment plan, which actually comes at the end as the fifth step, is nothing else but the implementation plan. So, for instance, let's say that in your statement of applicability, you have selected, I don't know, 105 controls as applicable. However, you already had implemented 80 controls previously before you started the risk management process, before you actually started the ISO 27001 implementation. This means that actually you have 25 new controls to implement. Okay, and these 25 controls is actually what you have to write in your risk treatment plan, and you have to define who is responsible for the implementation, what are the deadlines, what is the budget, who will be, let's say, involved in the implementation, how you will do the trainings, and so on. So risk treatment plan comes at the end because it defines actually the, you can consider it as the implementation plan for the controls that you have identified earlier in the process. Okay, Ahmed is asking for risk analysis applications. We can consider all applications in a company with the same level of confidentiality. No, I mean, if you go with the asset-based methodology, then you have to assess, let's say, the level of impact for each different asset differently. So, I mean, each company typically uses several applications, and the applications in, I mean, the data in some applications are simply more, let's say, sensitive than the data in some other applications. So this is something that you really have to distinguish. Now, of course, there may be applications which have, or the data which have the same level of confidentiality or the same level of sensitivity, and then you can consider, let's say, grouping those assets together. Okay. Let's see, I'm sorry, I couldn't read your name, but the question is, would it be misleading to term the risk severity level is risk itself? I have seen your slide number 9 offers similar connotation. Okay, I'm not sure if we, so basically risk severity, first of all, doesn't really exist as a term in ISO 27001. And the impact, if you are referring to this, is not enough of, let's say, not enough of, it's not enough as a number to show you how big the risk is, because the risk always consists of two basic parts. First one is what the impact can be, and the second one is how let's say, how probably this risk can happen. So you'll always have to take these two numbers together to show you the real value of the risk, especially throughout the time perspective. Okay, Saad is asking, what is the difference between risk analysis and risk assessment? Risk analysis is part of the risk assessment process. Okay, good. Now, let's move on with the slide because I want to be finished in normal time. Now, regarding assets, when you want to list all the assets, then you have to consider what do you need to protect. So typically these are, let's say, hardware, I mean laptops, servers and so on, software, information, and there you have to be careful not to list only electronic or digital information, but also the information in paper. Infrastructure, like, I don't know, electricity and so on. But you also have to list people, because your own employees are, of course, also assets, at least in terms of information security, and they have to be also taken into account, because, of course, they carry lots of risk with them, and so on. So basically, these are the examples, and when you start listing the assets, you just have to, you know, observe what you have around you and what you use, and this is the way to start listing all of your assets. Now, you have to identify also the asset owners right away, because it's easier then to identify those asset owners right now than if you do it later on. Okay, now the threats. Threats is basically what can happen to your assets. So for instance, if you have a server, then a threat could be a fire. If you have, I don't know, a data room or data center, then an earthquake can be a threat to this data center. If you have, let's say, a software, then a computer virus is a threat. If you have, again, I don't know, some kind of asset in terms of physical asset, or even if you have people, a bomb threat is then a threat. If you have an equipment like a laptop, then a malfunction is a threat. If you have employees, then key people leaving the company is a threat to this particular asset. Now, when speaking about vulnerabilities, then you can ask, why can certain threat happen in the first place? So for instance, if you have a lack of, if you have a fire as a threat, then vulnerability is lack of fire extinguishing system. Okay. If you have an earthquake as a threat, then lack of business continuity plans is a vulnerability in this case. If you have a virus as a threat, then lack of antivirus software is a vulnerability, and so on and so on. So basically, the idea is to connect assets and then find applicable threats, and then for each threat find, let's say, a couple of vulnerabilities which somehow enable this threat to happen. So this is the basic idea of how you combine these assets and threats and vulnerabilities. Okay, now let me move on to the next slide, and then I see that many of your questions are coming in, so I'll have to answer all of your questions after I finish this part. So the example of scales for impact and likelihood could be like this. So this could be like something like high, medium, low. So you don't really have to, think of some sophisticated scales for doing the assessment of impact and assessment of likelihood. You can use something as simple as low, medium, high. If you want to make it more complex, then you can use something. You can use the scales from 1 to 5, or you can use the scales from 1 to 10. It's really up to you. So the standard doesn't really tell you which scales you have to use. You have to use the ones that are applicable to your own circumstances. So for instance, if you have a small company, then you're fine with high, medium, low. If you're, I don't know, a large international bank, they're probably looking for at the scales of, I don't know, 1 to 10, because they're of course much more precise. Okay, yeah, just to mention here that when we speak about impact, then the level of impact is basically it has to take into account the consequences, I would say, of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you have probably heard of this CIA triad that is often mentioned in terms of information security, and this is where you take into account these consequences when calculating, or better to say, when assessing the impact. Now, when assessing the likelihood, this is where you have to assess the likelihood based on your experience and based, let's say, on how these kind of incidents are typically happening in your industry, or let's say in your vicinity, or in similar companies worldwide. Okay, now here you can see an example of risk assessment table. So this is how you can do it. And this is really a simple version of it. So if you're a smaller company, if you want to keep it simple, this is how it looks like. Okay, so you have assets. In this case, let's say you have a server. The owner of the asset is the system admin. The threat could be, let's say, electricity outage, and the related vulnerability is that you do not have a UPS, I mean the uninterruptible power supply. So the level of impact on the scale of 1 to 5 is, let's say, 4. The level of likelihood is 2, so rather low. So the risk here would be 6. 4 plus 2 makes 6. For the same asset server, you have a threat of fire, vulnerability that you have no fire extinguisher. Here the impact is bigger, it's 5. Likelihood is bigger, also 3. So the risk here is 8. Okay. So basically, it can be as simple as that. You don't have to make it more complicated, and believe me, you'll make your life much easier if you don't go into let's say more complication than this one. And just to explain here that as you can see, this 6 is in green color, and these numbers like 7 and 8 are in red color. And this is basically in, let's say, some of our risk assessment methodologies. This is where you define which risks are acceptable and which are not. So let's say you can define in your methodology that risks up to 6 are acceptable and that risks of 7 and 8 are not acceptable. And this is actually the input for your next step, the treatment. Then you will treat only those unacceptable risks, and you will actually you won't really be handling all these acceptable risks. Okay, good. Now let me go to the conclusion, and then after this I'll try to answer all of your questions. So my main point today is really this. Do not really skip this risk assessment. You will be very often surprised how much new risks you might find out when you do this task in a systematic way. Even if you do it in this simplified way, as I'm showing you, you will still reveal many new risks that you never actually thought that exist. So really, this kind of exercise will not only be mandatory for 27001, it will be also very beneficial to really save a lot of trouble to your company. Okay, very well. So basically, this is regarding the presentation, and let me go now to the questions and answers. I'm not sure, Gezim, would you like to add something here, or should I finish first all the questions? Okay, never mind. I'll go with all the questions and answers now. So Nagankam is asking risk equals impact plus P. In which methodology is it, please? I'm not sure what you mean by risk equals I plus P. If you could say it in words, I'll answer you then. So Saad is asking, ISACA defined risk identification other than risk assessment. Please brief. But I don't really know about ISACA methodology. What I can tell you is the terminology and explanation from ISO 27005. So risk assessment consists basically of risk identification and risk analysis. In risk identification, you find out which risks you have, and in risk analysis, you find out how these risks how big these risks are. And all of these together form actually risk assessment. Okay, who asks, the list of risks can be gigantic. Should we limit somehow the list of risks, and how? Well, basically what I do is typically this. If you have, I don't know, a company of 50 employees, you would typically have a list of risks, let's say 200 or 300. And you know, this is really more than enough to satisfy the certification auditor, and this is, believe me, more than enough to really open your eyes to focus you on really some big problems, I mean the biggest issues that you might have in a company. Later on, what I didn't mention is that you have to maintain your risks. I mean, you have to reevaluate your risks at least once a year. And you know, once you start learning how this is done, then you will find out more and more risks throughout time. So my point is really, you shouldn't start too ambitiously. You should really find, I don't know, something like for a company of 50 employees, maybe 200 or 300 risks. For the beginning, this will be fine. Later on, as you learn, you will find enough of risks that will be applicable. Okay, who asks, do you recommend to use both 27005 and 31000 in a complementary mode, or one replace the other and is redundant? First of all, 27005 and 31000 are quite different standards. 31000 is the standard which defines how to manage all the risks in your company, and it's not really specific to information security or business continuity or, I don't know, health and safety or anything else. It just tells you generally how to manage all the risks. On the other hand, 27005 is quite specific when it comes to risk, information security risk management. So what I would say is that you can do them, they're of course completely compatible, And what you should do is basically use them both. If you want to manage risks on the enterprise level, you will use 31,000. When it comes to specific information security risk management, then you use ISO 27005. Okay, Karti Kanand asks, any automated tool for risk assessment? Many are performing risk assessment but are not effective. How can one do effective risk assessment? Well, to be honest, if you want really effective risk assessment, then you cannot ask a machine to do it instead of you. Because, you know, the attackers are always finding out new ways on how to, you know, endanger your information, and you cannot really expect the software to think of all the combinations. So you can use a software or a tool to help you in this process, but you cannot do it completely automatically. There always has to be, let's say, a part of the human work in this process, because otherwise you will very likely miss a lot. And if you are asking me is it useful to use the tools, then I say yes, if these tools are not too complicated. Because very often, or more often than not, the tools for risk assessment are too complicated, and they only make your life difficult instead of easier. So, I mean, yes, go for a risk assessment tool if it is simple. If you can't find any simple tools, then you'll be better off with the Excel sheet. Okay, Dionysis asks, what is the mathematical relation between threat sources, threat parameters, probability of occurrence, asset vulnerability, and impact, if any? First of all, you can consider that impact consists of let's say, value of the confidentiality, value of integrity, and value of availability. This is all part of, let's say, the impact. And part of likelihood is the level of vulnerability and level of threat. So this is, let's say, easier way to understand this correlation. So threat and vulnerabilities are directly related to likelihood, and confidentiality, integrity, or availability are directly related to impact. Okay, Nignam asks, please, in which methodology it is said that risk is impact plus likelihood? You can find it in ISO 27005 as one of the suggested ways to calculate the risk. Can you please define risk tolerance and risk appetite? This is a question by Saad. Basically, any company needs to define which level of risk they will tolerate, and then you will basically then this is something that you have to define in your risk assessment methodology. Yeah, just let me just show you some links. I'll show you a link actually to a methodology, which, I mean, to the article which speaks about how to write the methodology. So just give me a second. Okay, so here's the link. Okay, good. Now, a question from Kaylor. Does ISO 27001 have something like a basic list of risks for many companies? Unfortunately not. There is no actually way to find out a list of risks for each and every company. It's simply not possible. What actually you can find is, let's say, a list of threats and vulnerabilities. I'll give you a link to also a list of threats and vulnerabilities, so just give me a second. Okay. So this is kind of, let's say, a catalog which you can use from our website. It's completely free. Okay, you can find it here. Araja asks, which difference between risk owner and asset owner? Okay, risk owner is responsible to resolve the risk, and asset owner is responsible for managing the asset. So this is the basic difference. Saad is asking where and when we define risk acceptance level. You define it in the before you start the risk assessment process, and this is typically in the methodology. Let's see, Letso is asking, I'm not sure if I followed your response. My question was whether I could call the number risk equals impact plus likelihood, or risk equals impact times likelihood as the risk or risk level. So basically the level of risk or the value of risk can be calculated by either adding or multiplying the impact and likelihood. So basically it's really up to you to choose the method or the calculation yourself. Okay, let me see some other questions. Okay, I'll see some questions from other people. Ahmed is asking, the asset can be owned to more than one owner. Well, I wouldn't really recommend this. It would be better if you have only one owner for the assets. Vladimir, one asset should have one owner, not many of them, because then you wouldn't really know who is responsible. Vladimir is asking, do you usually identify threat agent in real risk assessment, or is it just theoretical thing? Well, I'm speaking about the real thing here. You know, the whole presentation today is about real thing. If you want to do it only theoretical, then then you should really maybe listen to someone else. But I'm telling you, I'm giving you tips on how to do the real thing here, and not only to satisfy the auditor, but also how to help your company. Okay, Israr is asking, on what basis, how can we assign values of impact and likelihoods? Okay, now impact. The higher the potential problem is to your confidentiality, integrity, and availability, then you will have a higher impact score, and the likelihood will be higher if you already had some incidents of similar type, or if you know that these kind of incidents are happening, let's say in your environment. Okay. On the other hand, if you know there is no danger, let's say, to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, then the impact will be lower, and also the likelihood will be lower if nothing like this happens. You know, with these kind of assets and risks. Okay, Steen is asking, where can I see the links? So I've sent the links here through the control panel. So if you open the control, you will see this. Okay, Weil is asking, does ISO 27001 consider the risk of retired asset? Well, only if it can influence the security of the information. So if you have, as you call it, a retired asset, or the asset that is not in use, but if this asset still has some sensitive information in it, then of course there is a risk to at least confidentiality. Okay, Tino is asking, may I also have a link for the threats and vulnerabilities, please? Yes, I've sent this link also to this catalog. I've sent it through this control panel. Actually, I've just realized that I didn't send it to you. Okay, just give me a second. I'll send these links again. I'm sorry. Okay, let me find this risk again. Okay, here they are. So this is the risk link to the threats and vulnerabilities, and here is the link to this article about the methodology. Okay, here it is. Okay, good. Now, Muhammad is asking, if a company performs risk assessment regularly after a certain period of time, for example yearly, then should the same risk assessment methodology be used each time? It would be preferable, yes. But you can change the methodology, but this would also mean that you would have to reevaluate all the risks more thoroughly, because you will do it according to a different methodology then. Okay, Tarek is asking, I thought that the level of risk is equal impact times likelihood, but overall I think the risk is a probability of a threat to exploit a vulnerability, so risk is threat times vulnerability. No, this is wrong. So Tarek, risk is not threat times vulnerability. And you can take a look at ISO 27005. So you always have to take into account the impact. If you take only into account threat and vulnerability, then this is then you don't have this impact component. Okay, so it says, okay, I already done this. Saad is asking, does IT risk assessment possible without having enterprise risk management? Yes, it is possible. So you can do the assessment of your IT risks or of your information security risks without having any let's say, enterprise risk management in place. Saad is also asking, is there business impact analysis output can be helpful for risk assessment exercise? So if you did your business impact analysis as part of your business continuity, then yes, this output can be helpful for realizing how big the risks are. So yes, this is something that you can use. Imed is asking, how can we use multi-criteria risk analysis to evaluate impacts? I'm not really sure if I understand what you mean by multi-criteria risk analysis. Okay. let me see also other questions. So Tina is asking, in case of using the scale of high, medium, and low, what will be the possible risk result with the formula risks equals impact and likelihood? Basically, you can assign the values. So let's say you can assign that low means 1, medium means 2, and high means 3. And then you have the numbers which you can actually use to calculate the risk. Okay, Saad is asking, how can we validate the risk assessment as the information come from stakeholder could not be verified? Yeah, the methodology I was showing you here was the so-called qualitative risk assessment, which means that you assess the impact and the likelihood on a subjective level. So this is not perfect, but unfortunately the, let's say, applicable quantitative risk assessment is still not invented. It's still not possible to do it with, let's say, in some reasonable time frame and with a reasonable budget. So what are we, let's say, what we are able to do now is really doing only the qualitative risk assessment, and yes, then you are, in some cases, some of the assessments will be wrong. But the question is, what is the alternative? I mean, to pay something like, I don't know, millions of dollars for the quantitative risk assessment, of course, this is not a risk, this is not an alternative. Well, the alternative is to do nothing. So, I mean, it's really, you know, the only best way to do now is to do the risk assessment in this, using this qualitative risk assessment, although it's not perfect. This is what I agree. Okay. Good. Now, Retsilitso is asking, when do we use the product of impact and likelihood, or the sum of impact and likelihood to assess the risk level, because the risk levels will differ. You have to use only one method, either sum or the multiplication, and you have to use it for all of your risks, and this way you will have a consistent methodology. Also a question from Weil, what are main common area between ISO 27001 risk and corporate risks? Well, okay, I'm not an expert in corporate risks, but from the business point of view, I can imagine that, you know, it's, if you have, I don't know, some new business enterprise, and if you have some planning around it, and if some planning is leaking to some unauthorized users, then you could have this connection between, let's say, business risks and information security risks. But I'm sure you know that there are many other, let's say, examples of this correlation, and this is really a topic on its own. Okay, good. I think that I have answered all of your questions, so quite many questions. I'm sorry that I couldn't really go into too much detail about this risk assessment, because it's obviously a very complex topic. But what I would like actually to announce here is that in, let's say, a week or two, my company Advisera and PCB will be actually launching a partnership regarding the online courses. So we have currently an ISO 27001 internal auditor course, which will very soon be, well, you will be able to go for this course and also get PCB certificate for it. So this is the product that we're working for together with PCB, and I will be very happy to announce it, and you will be able to see it. I'll give you the link now, so you will be able to see the course already. And as I said, you know, let's say a week or two, you will also be able to go for this examination with the PCB certificate. Just to mention that these courses are free, so you can register for the course free. So just hold on, I'll send you the link now. Okay, so here it is. Okay, here's the link to the course. Okay, basically this is it. So. Gazim, can you please take over?
Yeah, Dejan. We also have around 2 people who have asked who has raised a hand and want to ask a question. The first one is Ivo Ritz, who wants to ask a question. I will unmute his microphone and he will be able to ask his question now. Okay, Ivo, you can go on with your question.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
How are you?
Dan, hi. Just want to, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
So the question is regarding your deal with PCB. So you have the company that that does the online education and helping in certification. I know that PCB will be able to certify the companies for the ISO standard, right?
Yes, yes. This is what PCB does. Yes.
So, is there a possibility for the company to gain the certificate via your two companies?
Well, right now we have this partnership for the online courses. So as I said, we deliver the online courses, and there is a possibility that the attendees of these courses or the students at these courses go for the PCB certification, or actually, to be more precise, this will happen in a week or two. We still didn't go into let's say joining forces, so to say, regarding the certification of companies. But this is certainly a very, very good idea, and since, I mean, my company Advisera is actually the biggest online website which provides services for the implementation, and PCB is definitely one of the leading certification bodies, it certainly makes sense. So yes, this is something that we will consider, and hopefully we will reach some kind of an agreement here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ivo.
Thank you, Ivo. Thank you, Dejan, for sharing this highly informative presentation. We believe the attendees had the chance to learn new things today, and I suggest you to take time and see our future webinars that we will be hosting. Next Wednesday, we will host a webinar topic which is called Exploring Payment Platforms on ISO 20022 and ISO 8583. You can also take time and visit our website www.pcb.com on the webinar section to register for our future webinars. Thank you once again, and hope to meet you soon in our future webinars.
Thank you.